friends. This is Kathy Lanzalaco of Inspire Careers, launching another episode of Spotlight on Careers. I'm really excited to bring my latest guest to you today, Julie Bastian. Julie is a corporate counsel with deep specialty in employment and labor law. And as a career coach, I get asked every single day from clients about certain questions that they have about the job application process. What can they be asked? What can they do? What can they say? And I know Julie is a wealth of information. So I'm really excited to bring her to you today. Our Spotlight on Career series is a series where I welcome a lot of different career professionals across a lot of different industries that can provide information that is of use and of interest to many professionals in all aspects. But this, I think, Julie's information today is going to cut across all industries and all types of businesses and help anyone who is watching this. So welcome today, Julie.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Thank you for inviting me here today. I hope to be able to provide some sort of basic knowledge for applicants and employees in all different industries. Again, my name is Julie Bastian. I've been a practicing attorney for about 13 years now. Most of that was spent in-house at a workforce solutions company. The company has, does operations throughout the United States and international as well, having over 10,000 employees in both the US and Canada. As a result, my day-to-day job duties focused a lot on employment law, whether it be, in New York State or federal law, and dealing with all aspects of the employment, the hiring, application, interviewing, during employment, and termination. So every day we would get questions that come up or issues that would come up. So, my goal here is to share some of that knowledge with the, so many people that are in the job market at this point in time.
Yeah, I appreciate this so much, and I know that our audience will as well. Sometimes these are the type of questions people don't know where to get their answers, and they're kind of afraid to ask them in some points too. So actually, I have compiled a list that I'm going to refer to here, and I'm going to ask you the questions. I've compiled a list of the top 5 questions that I receive most often from clients. And certainly as a career coach and with the history in HR that I have, I answer people's questions, but there's really nothing like hearing it from the attorney's mouth. So we're really glad to have you here today. And of course, I have to make the statement, we're not giving out legal advice here, but we do want to make sure that people have a sense of what some of these topics are and what the best practice answers for them are. So shall we get started, Julie?
Sure.
Every once in a while, I get questions from people about criminal convictions and arrests. So the question really comes up and says, can an employer refuse to hire an applicant due to a prior conviction or an arrest? And can employers terminate an employee due to a recent arrest, conviction, or accusation? So people have things in their history. Should that prevent them from applying for a job? Does it put them at a disadvantage? What say you, Julie?
I think this is a very common question that comes up. The reality is people make mistakes. They have things in their past that they've done. They've had an opportunity to overcome them. And I think, the question is, what do I do with that? And how do I turn that into a positive experience? And what do I tell potential employers? I'm going to focus mostly on New York here. Because I think most of our viewers are going to be in New York. So a lot of employers are doing criminal background checks. And so there are some laws in New York that protect applicants and employees from their conviction records. It's actually under the New York human rights law, conviction records is a protected status. So, I mean, this is a great state for somebody who does have a criminal background record. I mean, I think the most important thing I should say, up front, and I think this applies to most of the questions, we'll go over today, is that honesty is the best. If you try to get away with sort of withholding information or, saying something that's not truthful, it's going to come back to you. And I think that, that in itself is something that an employer can, decline an offer or terminate employment for. So in New York, we have the New York Corrections Law 23A, and it makes it illegal for employers to have sort of a blanket policy of no convictions. And I think, many employers do that, especially if they're doing business in multiple states. They can say, well, we don't accept anyone with, misdemeanors or felonies, that blanket policy, so that it's easy for our HR, personnel to deal with these type of things. So with that, what the human rights law is trying to avoid is employers discriminating against certain classes of individuals. So if employers can definitely in New York do a criminal background check, but they have to be careful on how they're using that information. Number one, employers should not be asking about conviction records prior to an offer being extended. And then they need to make sure that if they do the background check, obviously they're disclosing that they're going to do a background check. And then if something comes back, or if the applicant discloses something in their past, there's rules on what an employer can consider versus not consider. Having a policy that just automatically assumes that somebody has a poor moral character just because they have one or more convictions isn't going to work anymore in New York. What they want is employers to do an individualized assessment and take into consideration some of the common factors that can better evaluate whether or not the person is still fit for the job. Some of these things are, the age of the person at the time of the conviction, how much time has passed since then, what New York's public policy is on the type of conviction, the seriousness of the conviction, and most importantly, how that conviction is related to the job. Example, if somebody has a fraud or a theft conviction and they're trying to get a job in the banking industry, obviously that's going to be more relevant than, somebody, I don't even know, a theft conviction that's working in a position that has nothing to do with money or having any type of, they're not going to have access to any confidential information. So, the relationship is the most important thing that employers should use when trying to evaluate that. Certain things employers can't ask about. They shouldn't be asking about prior arrest that didn't result in any kind of conviction, or prior criminal accusations made against an applicant or an employee. And then any, youthful offender convictions or anything that has been sealed. So what they ask is that you go through this analysis. You can ask that on a, consent form. You're asking for whether or not they've had a conviction, not about prior arrest, but just the conviction record. And then once that background check has been run, it's up to the employer to take part in an individualized assessment with the applicant to determine whether or not they're fit. Another thing that's important to note is that employees or applicants are permitted to ask for some type of a written statement from employers if they're denied the job. So those protections exist under state law. Under federal law, we don't actually have anything that protects conviction, applicants or employees from conviction records, but the EEOC has issued guidance for employer, again, recommending that they go through an individualized assessment when evaluating whether or not somebody's fit for the position due to a criminal background. What their focus is, based on prior history, they're finding that employers that have a policy, a blanket policy like no criminal convictions, tend to discriminate against certain classes of individuals, protected classes. So what they recommend is that you do that individualized assessment. The other thing to note is in New York City, there's a recently passed, there was a law passed in 2015 that was recently updated called the Fair Chance Law. And it's again telling employers that within 10 or more employees that they can't ask about conviction records until after a conditional offer has been made.
Well, I'll tell you what, as you're talking, I can almost hear a collective sigh from people that are watching this, because I think there's so many people who don't understand those protections, particularly in New York State, but they just don't understand those protections so much. All right. Talking about things people can ask. Let's go back on that topic, whether they can ask about convictions. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about salary and about during an interview process, can an interviewee be asked about the previous salary that they made? I know there's been some changes in the laws in different states over the past few years, and this is critical in terms of protecting people that have historically made less money, women and minorities. So let's talk about this, because again, people aren't really clear on what they can be asked and not be asked, and where they should be drawing the line. So tell us about that, Julie.
Okay, I think you're exactly right, Kathy. There is a focus on, different classes of people, different genders, really getting to the point where they're being paid equally. And it's not based on their protected status, but instead based on their education, qualifications, and experience. So in order to further that goal, New York has passed laws that says employers cannot ask about any salary history, the prior salary history or compensation prior to an offer being extended. So what that does is, an employer can ask about what their desired compensation is, or where they would like to be, but they should not be asking about, how much they made in their prior positions. And the reason for this is, if previously they were paid less, that employer chose to pay less just because they were a female or because they were African American. What we don't want to happen is that same thing to continue into the next employment with the next employer. The offer of employment and this compensation being offered should reflect, again, their experience and their education, and an offer should be extended without that knowledge. If for some reason an employer gets some of that information, so that during the interview process, an applicant discloses it, what the obligation is on the employer is to then not use that information when putting together an offer for the individual, or not to search any kind of public database for that information. And it puts a lot of onus on the employer, but I mean, we have to start somewhere. So I think this is a great place where, people are really getting recognized for, their accomplishments and not necessarily for, poor behavior on prior employers. So I think that's in New York. There is a law in New York City, same thing. You can't ask about, applicants' salary and compensation, previous salary and compensation before that offer is extended. Now, there's nothing stopping an employer from, after an offer has been extended, at that point, they've already made the decision on the pay, and the applicant is either accepted or denied. And then at that point, if they want to verify, your place of employment, your job, your pay history, that information can be asked at that time.
But let's be clear, that can't change the job offer. That cannot go back and change what the salary
Absolutely not.
offered. Right.
Right.
That's excellent. And I know a lot of states have passed that law, and we don't, we won't go through all the ones that have, but it is important for anybody to watch it, is to see if it has taken place in your state, right? Certainly the best employers won't do it regardless of the law, but that does hold employers accountable. So definitely check your state to see if that has been implemented there.
And I think that same issue comes up on applications. So if you've got employers that do business in multiple states, sometimes they have old applications that ask that information. So, just knowing your rights and being aware of kind of what information should be asked and what you need to disclose is important.
Wow, that's a great point. All right, thank you. Excellent. Let's keep going on that vein of being, what's okay to be asked and not. So the next question that has been posed is, are there restrictions on what employers can ask about during the interview process outside of salary? So, for instance, protected categories under New York State and federal law, address what to do if asked about these during a topic. So can you discuss a little bit about some things people should be aware of if they come up in an interview, what is absolutely not appropriate?
Yes. So I mean, you're going to find this during your job search. Unfortunately, what happens is you have a lot of individuals, whether they be recruiters or HR professionals or just hiring managers, that don't have a ton of experience with interviewing. And, you know, by nature, people want to ask questions, ask about your family, ask about where you come from, things like that. But unfortunately now there are limits on what an employer can ask. And it boils down to, you know, questions about protected status. So under the New York Human Rights Law, you know, there is a lot. Well, I guess I should start with the federal law. You've got questions about, you know, race, religion, color, sexual orientation, gender, national origin, disability, genetic information. So that's what are the protected statuses under federal law, but then New York State has an expanded list. So it's important to kind of know what your rights are under New York State. So you've got the age, you've got race and color, religion, sex, disability, marital or familial status. So they shouldn't be asking about whether or not you're married or whether or not you have children, what your childcare obligations are, your, you know, current or prior drug or alcohol use, your criminal records, we just went over that, your national origin, if you need, you know, sponsorship, whether or not you have experience, and sometimes this comes up with conviction records, with domestic violence as a victim or as a perpetrator, and then, you know, gender identity or expression, military status, and then sexual orientation. So any questions that are designed at getting answers about someone's protected status should be off limits during that interview process. Again, you know, I think it still happens. Employers will ask about it. It doesn't always mean that they're looking to do something illegal with that information, but you know, they should be avoiding asking questions that that go down this path. And you know, I think you as the applicant or, you know, person being interviewed have to be prepared how you're going to respond when that happens. And I think it just has to be a case-by-case situation. You certainly can say, you know, I decline to answer, but I think it goes to whether or not there's something that you don't want to disclose. What's important is even if they do ask that question, it's what they're doing with the information. If the employer is using that information to discriminate against you, not hire you, not promote you, whatever it may be, you know, that act of discrimination is illegal. So you kind of have to be prepared for whether or not you're going to decline to answer, which doesn't always look great during an interview. Or you have, you know, some way of answering the question with as little information as possible. One example of that would be childcare obligations. So a lot of times employers will ask if you have restrictions on the times where you can work, whether it be first shift, second shift, third shift, and they'll ask whether or not you have childcare obligations that prevent you from working those shifts. You know, and when asked about that, they really shouldn't be asking about it, or at least in that manner. But a way to answer that question would be, you know, I'm available to work all three shifts, or I'm available to work first or second shift, without getting into those details. But just the asking of it really doesn't mean they've done something wrong. They shouldn't be, but it's how they use that information. So if you get into a situation where those kind of questions were asked, either on the application or during the interview process, and you feel that you've been discriminated against based on that information, you know, it's that time where you might want to seek, you know, advice of a professional.
Well, let me ask you about a situation that I think might happen more frequently than people even realize. People are giving up that information freely. Right? They don't even recognize that. And people walk into interviews and they're nervous. They want to be friendly. They want to be liked. And before you know it, they're talking about their kids. And they're talking about, you know, things that, you know, that the employer's not asking about. But now you're sharing those type of things. And there is implicit bias. There are things that people don't even recognize that the interviewer may consider throughout the hiring process. So what advice would you give to job seekers about that?
I think it depends on, your personality, and your experience, and, how open you typically are and what information you share. Um, Less is better, but at the same time, you want to be able to paint the picture of your experience and why you're a great candidate for that role. So if you feel like sharing some of that private information that you're not required to share, might be able to assist in painting that positive picture for them, or explaining why you're the better fit for that position than another candidate. You can do that. I would just be careful about oversharing. It also, takes time up during the interview process. And, as everybody's busy these days. So you want to just make sure that you're answering the questions that are being asked, and sticking to only those pertinent details.
Well, I think the best answer, for the job seeker that's actively interviewing is preparation.
Exactly.
The less nervous you are, the less likely you are to overshare. So understanding exactly what you're going to be talking about, what your answers are going to be, how you're going to carry yourself, right? All of those things, the preparation helps dispel those nerves, because I think it's when we get nervous that we start, oversharing and saying things that we probably shouldn't.
Exactly.
Okay, great. All right. While we're talking about this, I had a question, and I think this is another one that comes up, and it was included on the list, and I'm just going to kind of slide it under this that we're talking about. What about social media, Julie? I hear all the time people asking questions about, well, can they ask me about what's on my Facebook and my Instagram? Can they be looking? And I have heard job seekers that have been asked about their social media presence as well. So can you talk to that briefly about how that plays into interviews and employment law?
So this is just in general, a highly litigated topic. I think, right now, it's just the norm to have, a social media presence. It could be Facebook, LinkedIn, all kinds of things that people have. And I think the general rule, especially somebody who's in the job market, is, to just be aware of what you're putting out there. Understand that anything that you put out there on social media is accessible by anyone, including potential employers. So if you don't want to be seen, or if something can be misconstrued based on something that you put on social media, think twice about doing it, or delete it. Once it's out there, they say it never goes away, but at least it's something that you want to make sure that you're looking through your accounts as you enter the job market, and make sure that there isn't anything that you're not proud of, that's on that social media. Technically, employers should not be looking for ways to screen somebody based on their social media account. They shouldn't be asking for passwords or ID information to get onto those sites. But I'm just going to tell you that the nature of humans is they're curious. They want to know who they're meeting. They want to see if there's anything they need to be aware of, or that they should be asking about during that interview process. And I think, it would be silly for you as the applicant to do something that's intentionally going to, ruin your chances of getting a job. Just be cognizant of what you're doing, I think.
Well, I think too, Julie, just briefly, I think one of the issues that this really brings up is, I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of posts over these past several months, particularly about the presidential election, right? And there is freedom of speech. We can say what we want, but the reality is, if you don't have your controls on and you're saying inflammatory things, you still open yourself up to potentially employers that may not agree with that, or that take it in a different light. So, freedom of speech, and you can say whatever you want, and you should always believe and follow whatever politicians or whatever political party that you want to. But sometimes people get overzealous about politics and religion, don't they?
Exactly.
And you have to be cautious about those. I think it's critically important, and maybe this would be a good time to mention it to folks. You said it a second ago, Julie, really, checking your social footprint, your digital footprint, what is out there about you, not just on your Instagram and on Facebook, but Google your name. Google and see what's out there about you. Google and see what pictures are out there. You know, once it's out there, as Julie said, it never goes away. So even if you can still take things down off of a posting, but it's still somewhere. But you want to make it less accessible if it's something that, I don't know, you know, years ago that you did, and now you look back and say, what was I thinking? And you want to get that off of there, something that doesn't put you in a great light. And listen, people can post you and tag you and things, and you don't even know about it. So it's important to really continue to do that search on a frequent basis. Just like annually, you should be checking your credit report, because employers can do that too, right? So you should be checking just to be aware of what's in there. Use all of the controls and privacy settings that are available to you on your accounts so that you can feel very comfortable about, you know, whatever it is that you're posting in terms of that it's not open to the general public, and then it can be shared on an as wanted to basis.
Exactly. I think, you know, some other key points is just, like I said before, while it might be illegal for them to be intentionally looking for that stuff or using that type of information to, you know, impact their hiring decision, I mean, it's out there, and once they see it, it's really hard to forget what they've seen. Examples of that are, you know, pictures of, you know, applicants partying, using illegal drugs, things like that. You know, there's rules in New York State and other states as well about, you know, factoring in off-duty conduct in bringing that into the workplace. But like I said, the reality is once you've seen it, you know, they might not disclose to you the reason that I didn't hire you is because of what I saw on your profile, but, you know, it's out there and, you know, it's a possibility. So you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. So make sure that you are only putting things out there that you know, you're proud of or that you could explain in an interview.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. So let's talk about the next topic that I get a lot of questions on, and you just opened the door to it, about pre-employment drug testing. Right? This is always one. And of course, let's talk about, let's put it out there too with marijuana. There's a lot of controversy about that happening now. So can employers in New York require the pre-employment drug tests, and what procedures must be followed? Give us some insight into what's happening most recently with this.
Sure. I mean, I think you said it. This is an area that that you've got things coming at you from all different directions. You know, whether or not, you know, the locality has recreational marijuana versus medical marijuana. Is it a federal position that's regulated by, you know, the Controlled Substances Act, things like that. The general rule in New York is employers can do pre-employment drug tests. They can do a full physical on you. There's requirements around the timing of that. It's after an offer has been extended and before that person starts, but they can do pre-employment tests. They can do random tests. You know, they have to make sure that they're disclosing that to you. You know, you're doing a conditional, I mean, the drug test shouldn't be offered or performed until after an offer has been extended, and they should be identifying, you know, what type of test they're doing, whether it be urine or hair or blood test, the most common being urine test. They should also identify, you know, what type of drug tests they're doing, how many, you know, what panel search it is, if it's a 7 or 8 or 10 panel, so you know what type of medication they're looking for, drugs that they're looking for. So yeah, they can definitely do the pre-employment drug test. You know, many people question, what do I do if I'm taking I'm legally taking a prescription, you know, that's going to come up during that drug test. And there are rules that protect you under New York State, both New York State and federal law. You know, employers have to consider, you know, discrimination and harassment laws, and under New York State, under the New York Human Rights Law, and then also the federal laws. Also, you know, the American with Disabilities Act. So, you know, there are, you know, they should be using a, you know, legitimate vendor, you know, not, you know, using some person that you're not comfortable with doing. It's not a requirement that all employers use a medical review officer, unless it's a, you know, like a DOT job or something like that. But it's certainly highly recommended. And the reason for that is basically the applicant goes, they take the drug test. you might go into it knowing you're going to test positive because you are on certain medications, or you've used marijuana or medical marijuana. So what the medical review officer does is the test comes back, it's positive for certain substances. That medical review officer will call you and literally speak to you about, hey, are you taking any, legally prescribed medications that would account for this positive test? It's your responsibility at that point to prove that you are on those medications. And that might come in the form of, having the MRO contact your pharmacy or your doctor, or gathering that information from either of those individuals and providing it to them. Ideally, what should happen is when they get that information, they then go back to the employer and say, okay, well, they only tested positive for those substances where they couldn't provide a legal prescription. That doesn't always happen. It's up to the employer how they have that account set up. And there are reasons, legitimate reasons for that. So if you have a safety sensitive position or, do work with the federal government, you need to know what prescriptions they are on. Doesn't mean that you're not going to hire them because they have, they're taking a legally prescribed drug, but you need to know if there's anything that's going to affect your day-to-day awareness, and if you can safely perform those job duties while taking it. So at that point, when that information comes back to the employer, it's really up to the employer to then engage in a discussion with the applicant. If you're on it, even if it's legally prescribed, how often do you take it? Do you need to take it during the work hours? Do you need to take it outside of the work hours? Are you impacted? Does it affect your ability to do the job? And really, you have to have that, again, an individualized assessment of whether or not, you can safely perform those job functions while on that medicine. So that's kind of just in general. And what the overarching theme here is the American with Disabilities Act. If people are taking medicine for, some type of disability, employers are obligated to engage in that interactive process to see if a reasonable accommodation can be made so that that person can, still, take that medicine and also perform the job duties. There are certain exceptions if it's an undue hardship on the employer, but for the most part, if there's a way to make it work, the expectation is that that employer will do that. Then you have marijuana. So
the topic of the day.
You've got both the recreational and then the medical marijuana. What I'd like to say is that medical marijuana should be treated like any other legally prescribed drug, but unfortunately that's not the case because it's still considered illegal under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. So if an employer is a federal contractor or does work, so the position that you're applying for falls under a federal contract, there are drug-free workplace rules that applies to that. And therefore, that's that one scenario where it may be legal for them to say they can't accommodate the medical marijuana and they can refuse to hire you or terminate you as a result of that. But, they have to allow you an opportunity to talk through that process. And you also usually know if it is a federal contract when you go to apply for that job. So you kind of have an idea for it. When it comes to recreational marijuana, it's a whole different ballgame. So it's kind of that weird question. It's off-duty conduct. If you test positive, that means that you've used roughly in the last 30 days. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're using that day or while you're working. So this comes up with like random testing. But for employers that aren't federal contractors, I think they have to come up with their own policy of kind of what you're going to do, what they're going to do in that scenario. In New York City, they've decided for you that employers cannot test for marijuana or THC during the pre-employment stage. There are some exceptions, some carve-outs to that. law enforcement, dealing with children, safety sensitive positions, things like that. But for the most part, they're just recommending that you don't do any pre-employment drug tests that are looking for, THC or marijuana, because it's too hard. And once you have that information, you need to do something with it. So it's just something that a lot of jurisdictions are kind of moving away from.
Well, I
So,
think this is important too, because these laws are unfolding every day,
yeah, constantly
right? And
changing.
they're moving targets. So whatever we talk about today might be different tomorrow as employers are trying to figure out best practices, as the laws are changing. And I think the last topic we need to talk about, and I think this is a natural progression of this conversation, let's talk about vaccines in the workplace. Let's talk about, what you're hearing. And I know there were some laws recently, about can employers require people to be vaccinated? I just have a client reach out to me the other day and say he does not want the vaccine. Is he going to be required to get it? So let's talk about that before we close up today.
I mean, I think this has been an issue as long as we can go back. I mean, you had the H1N1, you had, any vaccines when you have somebody working in the healthcare industry, can you, mandate that they take them? Vaccines, can you require students to take them? Things like that. The reality is there are laws that protect people, protect employees. And the two main ones that we're talking about is the American with Disabilities Act, and then also, as a protected status, religion is protected. So, employers are stuck with kind of walking through that analysis of whether or not they have an obligation to provide an accommodation, which in this case might be refusal to take that vaccine, even though it's something that the employer feels would be for the overall good of the company and the employees. But especially when you have a situation like this where you have a vaccine that's been fast tracked, you have people that already just have certain opinions about vaccines.
Right.
A lot of people feel like there is not enough long-term research on it, and it's their right to choose whether or not they want to take that vaccine. And really, an employer doesn't have the right to make that decision for them. Some people have, certain medical conditions that they don't feel comfortable taking that vaccine. There have been, like you said, there have been some states, including New York, that have tried to introduce legislation that requires employees to take that vaccine. They've never been able to pass it before, and chances are it's not something that's going to be passed anytime soon. And it's just because you're taking too many rights away from an individual, whether it be for themselves, their child, whoever it may be. We can make that vaccine available and encourage it. Nothing wrong with employers encouraging it. I've seen people do certain incentives, literally paying them or giving them benefits off, or reduction off their health insurance, making it available at the site, educating people. I think that's the best thing employers can do, educating them on why it would be beneficial for them to take it, not only for you, but for the rest of the employees in the company, and then the clients of the company. But when it comes to making that mandatory, I think employers are just asking for trouble.
And again, this is another moving target, by the time we post this, because we do pre-record this, by the time we post it, who knows what'll happen. But also though, is the law passed though where people get 4 hours of vaccine leave, right?
Yeah.
For those that choose to take it and have to take it during business hours. So people should know their rights in regards to that too, that is paid time for them to go get vaccinated.
Yeah. Especially because, I'm sure by now everybody knows that as they're, introducing more categories of individuals that are eligible to get the vaccine, there's only so many sites that offer the vaccine, and so many vaccines available. So you've got a ton of people that are competing to get these limited appointments. And they're not, they are making them available on weekends and nights and things like that now at some locations. But, the reality is, as an employer, you have an obligation to accommodate the employees within, the restrictions of the law, give them time to take it. And it really, even if it wasn't required, it's certainly encouraged, because the more people that get the vaccine, the less, absences and, sicknesses, deaths, things like that, that you're going to find occurring in your workplace. So just smart.
Yeah, well, and as we said, things are unfolding quickly. So, every day you have to really keep your eye on the news. You have to be aware of what's happening. And importantly, you have to be aware of your rights. And employers, they're trying to keep up. There's been a lot happening. I mean, let's just, make sure that we're giving the plug to the employers here that are trying to do a good job. They've been through a lot of stress this year. They've had a lot of issues, and they're trying to do their best as well. So this information that we're sharing, we hope that job seekers, people that aren't even seeking jobs that are in the workplace, will benefit from this information, and certainly employers as well. So Julie, as we tie up today, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience. Is there any question that I did not ask you from my list of curated questions for my clients that you think would be important for people to know, or something you'd like to kind of just sign off with that is something else that people should keep in mind?
I think you kind of touched upon this earlier, but I think, as you go through, as you're looking for a job, as you're completing applications, submitting resumes, developing your resume, or, documents that you're going to use, and then going through the interview process, it's really important for people to be honest. During that process. Again, I'm not telling you that you have to share your whole life with them, but don't give out information that's false, because sooner or later that information is going to come back to bite you. And that in itself, just the fact that you weren't truthful about it, is enough for somebody to decline employment or terminate you. So if you do have something in your past that you're not proud of, or you've made a mistake, or you've done something since then, and you think that it's going to come up during the interview process, I think it goes back to being prepared. Deal with it head on. Make sure that you're ready to address the question when asked, or even if you somehow slip it in another answer, try to encourage, try to use your strengths, and things that have happened since that event that that will counteract sort of the negative effect of whatever that event might be. And just being prepared to be asked about that question, and then also to offer the reasons why you're still a great candidate, or the best candidate for that role.
And because it always comes down to the job. It always comes down to the job, and that's what people want to know. So Julie, thank you again so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise about employment and labor law with us. I know the people that are watching this are going to have a lot of great takeaways. So again, I encourage anybody to drop any comments or leave any questions. I will put Julie's, well, I'm going to tag Julie in this, so her URL is there. So you can certainly reach out and connect with her and follow any information that she shares on LinkedIn as well. So thank you, Julie. Thank you for everything. I appreciate this. And
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate your expertise. This is an area that I have not covered before on the Inspire Careers Spotlight on Careers. So I know people have been waiting for this, even if they didn't know it. So thank you again for doing this for us. And thank you all of us for joining us today. And everyone, have a wonderful day and live inspired.